Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Hunter Ohanian, the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and I'm very happy to have our guest this evening, Andrea Wallace. Andrea, say hello.
Hi, everyone.
Nice to see you. Andrea and I have known each other for over a decade. She and I worked together at Anderson Ranch, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'll also do a shout out to my colleague, Paula Sierra. Say hi.
Hi.
Nice to see you, Paula. Thank you. Paula will be behind the scenes, and so she will be making everything happen for us. And so just to give everybody a heads up, we are at the end of 2021 Pride Week, our Pride Month, and it's been a very, very busy time. But this year has been sort of interesting as we're coming off the big COVID pandemic. We're happy to continue to do these virtual talks. When we started them about a year ago, they were far more urgent. There was a lot of need to be able to put content out there and for people to talk to artists and writers about what was happening. And we didn't really know what was going to happen with COVID. We're now in a new place, so we're going to continue these talks through the summer, and then in the fall, we'll only be doing them twice a month, because I'm still convinced that even though I was not convinced in this format before, I am convinced that it's a way for us to be speaking to people throughout the country and the world, as we have been doing in the past, about things that are interesting to either literature or art or thinking or critical thinking or curation with regard to LGBTQ topics. And so if you are new to Stonewall, we've been around for 47 years. We're located here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We are one of the largest LGBTQ libraries and archives in the United States. We have 28,000 volumes in our library, and our archive has 2,600 linear feet. So if you imagine the Empire State Building, you'd go all the way up one side and all the way down the other to be able to contain all of that cultural history. And it totals about 6 million pages. So if you are in South Florida, please come to visit us. If you're not, you can see a lot of things through our website at stonewall-museum.org. We have 2 shows up right now at the library and museum. One is called Don't Ask, Do Tell, which is an exploration of the 225-year tortured relationship between the US military and the LGBTQ community. And we actually start in 1778, and one of George Washington's lieutenants who was imprisoned for sodomy. And then we end up all the way to the present day with President Joe Biden allowing trans people to serve in the US military. So that exhibition is available for people to see anytime at the archive and the library. And then also we have another exhibition up, which has been curated by Megan Kent, who is the chief curator at the Center for Arts and Culture in Hollywood, Florida, called Off Our Backs, which is looking at early lesbian publications from 1956 to 2000. And what I always find interesting about that is that where gay men may have fetishized themselves or objectified themselves and others, and the lesbian publications, they're talking about building community, identifying oppression, sexual autonomy, and so issues that we find very important right now as all of us deal with many of these issues in front of us on a daily basis. So both of those shows are up right now. If you don't get our weekly newsletter, you can go to stonewall-museum.org and you can get that. And I think those are all the details I have. Oh, one last thing, we are in the middle, we're at the very end of a membership drive. And so please, if you've not become a member, we're about 89 or 91% of our goal. We have to work on it in the next 2 days, so please help us get to that goal. Membership starts at $35, and so that's very important. And finally, I want to say hello to all of our friends on Facebook. It's great to see all of you here, and I know many people see these talks on Facebook and on YouTube, and so it's great to see all of you here as well. So if you have questions, if you're here, throw them into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to those as we go through the conversation. But we can go ahead and start. And so I'm going to go throw it over to Andrea here. So Andrea, let me just get to a full screen here. One moment, please. View, gallery, here we go. So Andrea, hello, how are you?
I'm good, Hunter. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. So we're finding you in Aspen. You're at about 7,200 feet up in the air. And how long have you been in Aspen?
Well, I've been at Anderson Ranch since you hired me 13 years ago when you were the executive director. And I've been here this whole time. And I started as a director of photography, and I've continued to do that, but also now I'm also working as a vice president, kind of overseeing a lot of the artistic programming, all of the artistic programming at the ranch.
Yeah. And then, of course, you have been making your own work all this time as well, too. And I'm looking for my little, so let's go a little bit to Andrea's background. So as you say, you're Vice President of Artistic Affairs, and you received your MFA from the University of Colorado at Boulder. You were previously an assistant professor at Lake Forest College and Willamette University. And of course, your work has been exhibited nationally and internationally with numerous shows throughout the Americas, China, and Middle East. And so we're going to talk about three artists this evening, three gay artists this evening. But I want to talk just for a moment about your work. And I would love to have an opportunity outside of this particular venue, but I would love at some time to talk about your work, because one of the reasons why I wanted you as part of the series is there is a way that you kind of move through the body, you move through race, you move through gender, you move through class, you move through age in a variety of ways, which a lot of your work is really very similar. Even though one can't call it gay work or queer work, there are themes in your work which really sort of transcend a lot of those thoughts.
Right. So the work that I've been working on most primarily for the past 10 years, 13 years is kind of focused on my son and his best friend. And it's about boyhood, but it's also in friendship. It's about intimacy. It's about that construction or movement towards masculinity. I think when boys are young, they're kind of androgynous, and there's a lot of like another, I don't want to say feminine, but it's just another kind of energy, maybe feminine energy, maybe a different kind of energy. And as they get older, there's a movement, both physically and emotionally and socially, certainly in our society, to move towards this, whatever this thing is called masculinity. And that's the kind of what I'm trying to get at in the work and the portraits of them.
And Bo, of course, is what, he's 15 now? Mm-hmm. And he's probably a good, 5 inches taller than you are, growing in. Yeah. But again, I think of you as being a wonderful ally to the LGBTQ world, but yet you're not a stranger to it in your own family. Right.
So I grew up with a single mother who was a lesbian in the 70s and 80s. I mean, she still is a lesbian. I was joking that she has Alzheimer's, so she doesn't know she's still a lesbian, but she is. And I grew up with her and her partner, who is really like Bo's second grandmother. So it's not a stranger to me in my world in any way.
Yeah. And this was in central Massachusetts, western Massachusetts?
Right, 30 miles north of Boston in Bradford, Massachusetts. Small town, Catholic family. It was not very well accepted by my family or the community that we lived in. And it was definitely something that shaped my childhood, my adolescence, and kind of how I move in the world today.
Right. So for those that don't know about Anderson Ranch, you and I, of course, do, and I was there for 3 or 4 years, but give people a sense of Anderson Ranch today. Who does it serve? What does it do? Tell us a little bit about it.
So the Anderson Ranch is located in Snowmass Village outside of Aspen, Colorado, and we are going on 53 years. And it's an artist, it kind of started as an artist community, and it still is. It's definitely a place where it's an educational place where we run workshops, but we also really just, we support art making. It's definitely a maker's paradise, which is what a lot of people kind of refer to it as. But there's also opportunities to support artists in terms of critical dialogue, our summer series program where we have lectures. So we run workshops, we run residency program, we have visiting artists coming in out of the studios, and it's a real sense of community. Like for this summer, we have about 900 students that will come through the ranch in our workshop program with instructors from all over the world, all over the country coming in. The residency program brings in emerging and established artists twice a year for 10 weeks or 5 weeks. And then we're constantly bringing in by invitation visiting artists of all different mediums to work in the studios and support them in the making of their work.
Yeah, and I think when I was there, you and I spent a fair amount of time working on that residency program, trying to redefine it and and so how successful do you feel the residency program is these days?
I think the residency program is, and since you were here, and I know you put a lot of work into really building the foundation of the program, I think it's very successful, and we have a certain number of the residencies are endowed. So when people apply and they get that residency, it's an outside jury that selects the residents, 14 in the fall and 14 in the spring across all media. Then they pay nothing to be here. And then for those that don't get the endowed residency, it's a pretty nominal fee to be here for 10 weeks. And we cover room, board, and studio. So it's a wonderful thing. We also are now doing a residency with an organization in Florida, Ulite Arts. And those residents come for 5 weeks to the Ridge every spring. And that's part of their kind of residency with Ulite. So that's a partnership that we've developed.
Great. Well, it's so lovely to see these crossovers between other part of the country, because of course Aspen and Snowmass Village is a very rare place, and for those of you who've not been there, I mean, again, as I said earlier, it's it's 7,200, 8,000 feet above sea level, and you're in the
mountains.
In the mountains, and it's sort of astonishing. I would drive. I lived in Basalt and worked in Snowmass when I was there, but every day, whether it was spring or summer or fall or winter, it was like driving through a snow globe every day. It was just this magical thing we would go through that would of course it's a very privileged area. I mean, certainly there's classism that goes on there, and of course those of us who've spent time there, Andrew, you spent more time now than I have, certainly, but I mean, all of us have seen that, and I don't mean to say anything pejorative about it, but it is different in those ways.
No, but I think that is something that Anderson, we have worked on very hard over the time I've been here, more recently, really developing the scholarship program and really developing just our faculty and visiting artists to make sure we are representing diversity and being a voice and a leader in that, because it is such a non-diverse, privileged area here in the mountains.
Yeah, and it is what it is, and I'm not trying to put any pejorative sense on that. It what it is with that. So we have 3 artists that we're going to talk about this evening, and so I know that you have a PowerPoint that you put together. And
I do.
Kind of cue that up, and then as you're queuing that up, maybe you might want to give everyone a sense, sort of just a quick overview of these 3 artists, how you've worked with them, how you know them, And
Sure.
then we go through the slides and talk about the work.
Okay, why don't I do this? Why don't I share the screen and then I'll bring up the presentation? Can you see that?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, so Hunter, when you reached out to me, you know, and I started to think about who would be the artists that I would want to sort of talk about, and I chose 3 artists, two kind of photo-based artists and 1 painter that I have some relationship to, either kind of a long-term relationship or relationship through Anderson Ranch. And the first artist I immediately thought of was Jess Dugan, who was actually just at the ranch about a week ago teaching with us. I met Jess when Jess was in graduate school at Columbia College, maybe, I'm not really even sure, maybe like 6 or 7 years ago. And since then, you know, his career has really taken off, making a lot of intimate portraits that engage with issues around identity and sexuality and gender. And Jess has come to the ranch as a faculty and as a visiting artist. And then Doron Langberg is a painter, wonderful painter, which I'm sure a lot of people watching know Doron's work. Doron has also had a long relationship with Anderson Ranch, teaching with us, and most recently being a visiting artist with us this past spring in our print shop, working with our master printmaker and creating an editioned series of monoprints. And then Paul Sepuya is someone that I kind of met through Jess into the Strange Fire Collective. And Paul has not yet been to Anderson Ranch, but we have been in conversation for about a year now, and he's planning to be here next year as a visiting artist. So those are the people that I chose, partly because I know them and partly because I know their work pretty well, and I thought it fit for the subject matter that we were going to talk about.
That's great. And of course, I've worked with Jess and with Paul. I've not worked with Doron. And Jess, I just saw either on Facebook or somewhere, did Jess just sell half a dozen prints to the Norton Museum?
Yeah, I think I saw that they sold 8 prints.
Wow.
Which is a pretty amazing and a congratulatory kind of thing to happen. So very exciting for them.
Yeah. Let's talk about Jess's work. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I would just say too that Jess's work, the work that I chose, I mean, there are several, they have several monographs out, and they have the most recent one is called To Survive This Shore. But when I thought about the work that I wanted to talk about, I thought about the kind of earlier work, and then which is still ongoing, and it's Every Breath We Drew. And it's a series of images that really talk about identity and power and desire and connection within the framework of the queer experience. And within this work, I also chose images that Jess has done that are self-portraits that are part of this work, and kind of also, but could be seen kind of as almost a separate body of work. But what I'm so drawn to, and this is an artist that I really look to a lot when I'm thinking about portraiture. The work really talks to a sense of masculinity, but kind of like almost a quiet, gentle masculinity. Just photographs people that are their friends, people that they meet, people that they make a connection to. And something, I was in conversation with them a couple of weeks ago for a lecture here at the ranch, and something they said that I thought was interesting is that they wanted their work to really speak first to humanity and to have the viewer question assumptions around gender and around what we assume that we know about someone. And also maybe to confront our own levels of being with someone, or that we don't know what their gender is, or we don't know what their sexuality is. Just talked about that most people assume that everyone in this body of work is LGBTQ. But that's not necessarily the case, and I think it's important work, I think, for the LGBT community, but also an educational kind of work for those who are not part of that community.
And let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt
Yeah.
you because I think it's sort of it's a great point that you make, and something that many of us who have done work about quote unquote gay art, we are beginning to challenge, thankfully, the necessity of putting these monikers and these definitions around this stuff. You know, we're just coming off of Pride Month, and of course, what Pride means is people being proud of their sexual orientation. But then also looking at this amazing portrait that you have on the screen right now, that there may be a queer sense to this particular piece, but also the subject or the maker's sexual orientation is kind of meaningless. That one can have an eye about creating work about an individual that is almost devoid of the subject's orientation or point of view. And I fault myself because I've been in this business for a while, but you know, we find these pigeonholes that we have to put this stuff in. And so your point is so well taken about your interpretation of Jess's work, where it really is about the human experience is what they're trying to portray here.
Well, and I think also, you know, they talk about the work being kind of a connection, like a vulnerability, making these connections with people, allowing these people to be vulnerable, and kind of like making that connection and making a photograph within that connection. I know that their process is a slowed down process. They work deliberately and quietly and slowly, and I think that shows in the work. I think another thing that's part of this body of work are a beautiful collection of still lifes that become metaphors for all the things that are being talked about, and also that quiet kind of vulnerability, but also a quiet kind of masculinity, a gentleness. And then I think within this body of work, and you know, I'm not saying the titles of these because it's in my notes, but I'm showing full screen, so I'm not, but the titles are the subject's names, and I think that speaks to that connection as well. I think that there are portraits of couples, there are portraits of individuals, and something else I think about a lot are just the incredible formality of the work, the formal constructs of portraiture that harken back to an obvious nod to painting and to other photographers that have come before that have very formal elements in their work. But something I think a lot about with Jess's work is the hand gestures, the body language, and specifically the hands. Jess seems to be very aware of the power of the hands, and that what hands communicate and what touch and position communicates in the photograph. I think this is one of a newer piece that was just recently done on a trip to Boston. And again,
of course, this sort of echoes back to, you know, Felix Gonzalez Torres or some other wonderful, amazing pieces that, you know, I know nothing about this piece. I've not seen it before, but of course, it can speak about relationship, about loss. It can speak about nurturing. I mean, there's so many things that I'm seeing in this particular piece, not to mention the sort of the craft, and Jess is of course wonderful with their craft with regard to it, but it's so rich in so many different ways.
And I think too that also very obvious in the work, and here's one of the self-portraits, is light, that they're so tuned into light. And I think also that when I think about the work, you know, you think about just wanting to be, or being drawn to a kind of a sense of, like I keep using that term, gentle masculinity. But I think this is something that Jess is also attracted to, not only for her subjects, for their subjects, but for themselves. And I see that in the portraits that they construct, the self-portraits they construct.
Also, I think what I love about Jess's work in this way, and when we talk about Paul's work, I see the same thing. So for those artists that do so much portraiture, what is so wonderful for me is that they're exposing the vulnerability of other individuals in their work. And so for them not to be exploitive of somebody else's body, of their persona, of who that individual is, they work hard to be sure that however much they expose somebody else, they're going to work hard to be sure that they're exposing themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly for photographers and painters, I think that's an amazing gift that they give us, because they're revealing themselves through their own work, but they're also not going to be just putting somebody in front of the lens. They're going to be showing themselves at the same time.
Right. So they're willing to submit to that same vulnerability. And also, I think it's also a way for so many artists to understand themselves and the world around them. And I think that Jess is one of those artists that uses the camera to better understand themselves, their own body, their own place in the world, and obviously the people that they come in contact with.
Beautiful piece.
Yes, stunning. And obviously you can't not think about the formal, the color. And what's interesting, we look at the portraits that are like deep red, deep blue, and then you have this, which is really soft, kind of creamed earth tones. And so their palette is really broad when it comes to being able to use light and color to affect the mood of the photograph.
Just to say one thing about this image, since I know a fair amount about it. This was in a hotel room in Chicago, and Jess and I was working on a particular project at the time, and Jess and I agreed to do a series of portraits. But what's interesting about this piece is that Jess made this image and then posted this image to Instagram or someplace in social media. And the image was perceived, because of Jess's relationship as being a transgender individual. The image was perceived, based upon the way they shot this piece and they put this piece out there, that the subject was transgender. And I got a call from Jeff, and to say, I just want you to know, I put this image of you on Instagram, and people think that you're just so you know, it's been interpreted as being a transgender man. I hope you're okay with that. And I thought, oh my God, this is wonderful. I'm not okay with it. I'm thrilled by it, in the sense that we can actually possibly conceal ourselves. Can we show ourselves? Can we be vulnerable in a particular way? It makes the work so very powerful in that way.
That's a very interesting part of that conversation. But I guess on the flip side of that is that idea of people have to have a need to put everything in a box. And so if it's a transgendered artist, they must be photographing transgendered only. So there's a very narrow, and when I get to Doron's work, I'll talk about it as well, that there's a very narrow kind of way people often look at queer artists and their work, that it is only about this, because they're a queer artist, therefore the work has to relate to this, or someone's transgendered, their subjects have to be transgendered, instead of being able to look at the layers.
Right. And again, that's exactly the point. And again, not saying anything about the artist or the artist's viewers on IG, on Instagram or something else, but you're absolutely right. We all innocently kind of bring our own perspective to these things based upon the understanding of what a particular artist is and how we see a particular figure. And here's an example in which, because of what a particular artist was known for, they looked at a subject and came to a particular conclusion. And we have to be careful, I think, to be sure that we are more open to those kind of things, and we can interpret them for what they actually are. Oh.
And again, it's the light, that subtle shadow on the side, the gestures, and the way Jess art directs and connects with their subjects to get these kinds of images. I feel that these people in the subjects really give something to Jess in this making of the photograph. And I think there's a clear kind of intimate connection between them that happens, and then, you know, subsequently becomes the image.
So as someone who's made a lot of portraiture, apart from those family members you've shot, do you feel it's difficult to pull this degree of intimacy out of your subjects?
I think it can be, but I also think it's the way, I think it's a couple of things. And yes, I don't think it's easy. I think these images make it look easy, but it's not. And I think Jess is often photographing people in their homes, in their bedrooms, which is, there's a sense of vulnerability right there that these subjects allow Jess to come in and make these images. I think it's partly who Jess is as a person and the way they move in the world that allows people to feel safe and feel a connection and feel not only that, but feel like they're being seen. Mm. And that's a very different thing than just someone being photographed. It's they're being seen. That's what I think about when I look at these images. And I think that has a lot to do with who Jess is and also how Jess works to construct the photograph. They work with a medium format camera. They always work on a tripod, which I've sort of like watched. They photographed me before, but I've seen them photograph other people, and I started using a tripod as well, because I think, yeah, that is a much slower way of working, and it allows for the subject to relax. It allows for some back and forth, some conversation, some kind of connection to be able to create the image here.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at this, I don't know that I've seen this image before, although I saw a preview. But this is now speaking to Jess's knowledge of art history, and the sense that this looks like a George Tucker or a Cadmus painting. I mean, now they're bringing these other things into this work, which is so reflective of other artists as well too, and contemporizing them. It's such a beautiful portrait.
Yeah, and I believe Jess, and if Jess sees this, Jess will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but worked at the museum at Harvard for a long time, cataloging paintings and photographing the artwork, and also has an art history degree. So there's a big nod in these images in reference to kind of the iconic painting and the way the figure is presented. I mean, I think this is just wonderful with the color again, that strong formal color, the patterns of the flowers against the hair, you know, on the arms and the chest, the gesture, the look. I mean, it's just stunning. And this is another I actually own this one. This is a self-portrait. I'm going to keep moving just because I know we're going to move to some other artists, but I just think that I'm excited to see that Jess is continuing to add to this series, is going back and kind of finished where it seems to be somewhat wrapped up, this Divide the Shore, and is now adding more images to this body of work. The other thing I think that's interesting too, is I look at some of the newer photographs, Jess is thinking a lot about engagement with the viewer. And so often when there's two people, one person is engaging with the viewer and the other person is engaging with the other subject. And so I think there's an interesting kind of back and forth between the viewer to the subject and then the subject engaging with the other subject. And I think that makes it a much more active kind of portrait.
Oh, completely. I mean, and this is a perfect example of it. Of course, the subject in the foreground is all about us, and the subject in the background is all about that subject. And so to see the relationship between the two is brilliant.
Right.
This is Jess, of course, self-portrait. And this has been around for a while. And I find this to be very iconic of Jess's work.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think this is an earlier self-portrait. And I think this is, you know, when you look at the self-portraits, it's, I'm going to go forward. And here's one with Jess's wife, Vanessa. And so there is another body of work, or within this body of work, there are images of Jess in relationship as well. And that's something you talked about, the self-portraits and them becoming vulnerable as well, but then also making self-portraits as well with their partner. And I know that there's another body of work, you know, that they're making with their partner and daughter, which they're not really showing yet. But certainly that's a whole other more personal body of work that's happening.
Yes, and just as an aside, I don't think you have it here, but for people who are interested, Jess made a fair amount of work with her mother and her mother's partner as well too, which is really sort of interesting about gathering that all of those pieces of information and putting them together in work.
And also recently too, Jess has made a film, which is a kind of a letter to their father, which is also another way of working. Another self-portrait. And again, this is like one subject, you know, connecting with the viewer, the other subject connecting with the other person. And this one is probably one of my favorites. It's just so reminiscent of painting. Just the way the figures in the grass, the hand, and that hand is just lovely, the way it sort of folds over. And then I think this might be the last one. This is a more recent, new self-portrait.
And again, you know, Jess is putting themselves out there to the point that they're not exploiting or turning their subjects into props. Everybody is fair game here, which I obviously totally applaud. All right.
So I'd like to talk about Doron. Doron is an artist whose paintings really celebrate kind of queer pleasure, friendship, companionship, intimacy, family, sexuality. They work in oil, or he works in oil, and a lot of his images kind of blur these distinctions between abstraction and figuration. They work with a really colorful palette, really rich, saturated colors. He paints his friends, his family, his lovers, his husband. And the work is, you know, again, the formality of the color is just sensational. What he talks about with his work is that this kind of a continuation of this conversation with Jess's work, where he talks about wanting to paint everything from, that his queerness is rooted not just in like sexuality, but in every moment of every day, from mundane moments, and where he paints in sort of still lifes and just conversations, to more erotic and intense sexual moments. And he wants to sort of paint everything and wants to be known as an artist who can contribute to the conversation in a much broader context, so that his work is not narrowed down to a queer artist painting just, men and penises and acts of sexuality, but everything. And I think the paintings, the brush strokes show so much movement and passion and intensity in the way he abstracts. A lot of like kind of visceral brush strokes. Sometimes small paintings are used as studies for larger paintings. He also talks about that he works primarily from observation. He used to work, and he's kind of a long formal training in studying the figure and in drawing. He went to Yale, graduated 2012. And he's in New York now.
Beautiful, beautiful work. And of course, the idea that from a painting standpoint, that his skill is unparalleled today. There are not a lot of people that can do the figure in this way. And also he's bringing so much movement into these pieces as well too. Now, a lot of them, the movement is brought in a sexual context, but that's actually very good because he's being very honest about it. And then you look at these flowers that are just astonishing.
And I think, in this work with the flowers, they're kind of a nod to kind of like a Mapplethorpe or Ross Bleckner, and it's a very intentional nod, I think, that Doron makes when he's doing these still lifes. Now, this is a painting that is called Family, and this is actually his husband's family. And he really, and it's huge. It's like 96 by 80 something. And I mean, I think this is really, the pattern reminds me of Andrea Crosby, who's another painter who Doron went to Yale with. But I just think the color is fantastic. And then there's more scenes that are like a beach scene where, so he really tries to sort of say that, he wants to be known and as his subject matter being very broad, because that's how he thinks about his own queerness, and that it's in every part of his life, from not only his sexuality, but like what he wears, what he consumes, how he talks about things, what music he listens to, and he wants that to be part of the paintings. So I think the other thing that I think about with this work is the emotional atmosphere that's created in the paintings. And there's an intensity, not only from the formal aspects of color and brushstroke and content, but in the moods of the subjects themselves. Do you recall lilies?
Yeah.
And sometimes when the images are more of more kind of intense, sexualized, they become more abstract. And so there's almost like there's more movement, there's more abstraction that happens.
But of course, the beautiful thing about this piece, apart from the erotic sort of and sexual, but then also how they're not afraid to sort of put contemporary culture in very traditional painting. So here we see a subject with their iPhone out and then masturbating at the same
Yeah.
time. And but yet you have a very classic composition of a piece here. And of course, that's how culture evolves. I mean, this is, you know, this is what culture's about. It's just building on one thing after another.
And I think also when you think about, I think as you start to look at the broader body of his work, it's they kind of, it's a continuum and they contextualize each other, because it's he paints so much, and like here, like the socks on the floor, and like the kind of that the abstraction, but then like the details of the stripes on the pillow, or just the way the figure lies on the bed, or the light falling on the figure. So Doron had a pretty big show at Yosti Milo, I think about a year ago.
Yeah.
And I think his career is just taking off.
Yeah. Beautiful work. So, so did you say he's teaching at the ranch this year, or?
He's not teaching this year. He has been teaching with us for about maybe 7 or 8 years.
Right.
And then, but I think now, right now, he's becoming so big, and you know, his work is so sought after that he's really now not teaching and just really primarily focusing on making work.
Sure.
And I mean, I love this. This is just so much about connection and companionship and comfort and home.
And again, this also points out what you mentioned before about his and you as a photographer, of course, you can see this where so much is in focus and then so much is out of focus as well too. And we've seen this in a number of these paintings, and so it's so interesting about how people can talk about photography being very painterly, but here we're looking at paintings that are in some way very photographically.
Well, I think that's a really good point that you just made. I haven't really thought about that, but you're right. It's that shifting plane of focus,
Yeah.
where, you know, the foreground is out of focus, and you go back to this little like cup that's in focus. Then you go to the chair that's out of focus, and then you go to the picture in the back that's in focus. It's just shifting planes of focus.
There was one that you showed. We don't need to go back to it, but the face was fully in focus, but everything else was out of focus. And it was really very nice. Yep, I can see it here too.
Yep, yep. And also look at the paint, like the tactility of the paint and the surface of the painting, I think is something that, he works in oil, and it's just that the tactility of the paint is something I'm always drawn to, especially with an image like this. Just a couple more here. Okay, and the last artist I wanted to talk about is Paul, and I know, Hunter, I think you have worked with Paul.
I have.
And what I'm really drawn to about Paul is not so much that the portrait is the end all, but that the work is rooted in portraiture, and the work that's where the work starts from, and also that Paul is an active participant. But something that I think about, or that I'm aware of with Paul's work, is that he talks about that although he's in the work, it's not a self-portrait. That he sees the work and the way he, that if he's in the image, it's because let me back up. The way he places these images with the camera and the tripod kind of at the center of the composition, and he has a series of work where there are black backdrops, And he and his friends and people that he knows make images together. But if he's in the image, it's because he's in there to activate the camera, not because it's a self-portrait. And it's really about deconstructing kind of the whole act of photography. But what I'm also drawn to is his use of black, the black material and the black body. So these are mirrors. So these photographs are taken into a mirror, and by using the black cloth and his black body, you're able to see the smudges and the marks on the surface of the mirror that he says are important to the image. And that's kind of a nod to the whole history of photography with, you know, the dark room and the dark cloth. And he talks about the idea that only some of the information is only seen when we go right into the darkness. And part of that is using his own body to be able, you know, to not reflect certain areas of light so you can see what's happening on the surface of the mirror.
Yes, completely. And again, your point is very well taken about his role in these images. They can be misconstrued as being self-portraiture, and in other artists, in other work, we have certainly seen the artist in them, and those are a degree of self-portraiture. But his work is there as a maker, and also, like we were talking about Jess as well too, in the sense that Paul is not going to put a subject, he's not going to deal with a vulnerable subject and both the person and the subject of the image without putting himself in the same role as well too. He's not going to objectify, he's not going to subject somebody else to something that he wouldn't do himself. And that's a wonderfully fair way of making this work. And it's not about him, it's not about the subject, it's about the work itself.
And it also speaks to the whole operation, I think, of photography, the way he's activating the camera. And I think it's not about, like, as opposed to like Jess's work or Doron's work, where I feel like they're talking very specifically about identity, Paul talks about his work as being not about identity specifically, about the individual people in the image, but about more of like an attempt to situate Blackness and queerness as a starting point to look at photography.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting thing, because I think that the initial read would be wanting to assign meaning or assign identity to the people in the photographs, as opposed to it being more about kind of an attempt to look at a broader situation.
And these two images, of course, are just so amazing because they speak to a vulnerability that the artist is placing himself to those of us who are the viewers, that they know that many people who look at whether they're photographs or paintings, that there is a tremendous amount of craft. And here they are slightly making fun of their own ability by putting somebody else's hand on the paintbrush or on the camera. And so they are releasing their vulnerability in that way, which of course makes them incredibly powerful to be able to do that. Just flip back to that last one. The idea of Ansel Adams allowing himself to be photographed with someone focusing that, the most crucial thing for a photographer. Imagine how threatening that would be to so many photographers to allow a portrait being made with someone else focusing the photograph. It's nearly unheard of.
Absolutely, it's like sacrilegious almost. And I think the other thing too is that he often refers to, like, he doesn't make tricky photographs, in the sense that everything is seen, everything that's happening in the space is put forth. So there's nothing tricky about what's happening. and he shows everything. Everything is apparent. And then often they will make a photograph and then make a print and then tear it up and then reconstruct and rephotograph as like what you're seeing here. And he used to work primarily in film, but actually moved to digital just for the expediency of being able to photograph, make the print, reconstruct, deconstruct, and rephotograph.
Yeah, and of course, this shows a lot of the work he's been doing recently, I mean, the last 5 or 10 years, about the idea that there is this plane that he's cutting up. He's taken the entire canvas of the photograph, and he's left us as viewers to not fully understand what we're seeing when we first see it. So he's very intentionally challenging us to see what we're seeing in this particular picture. And that I find he does very successfully.
Well, and I think there's something, like when I think about it too, there's something sculptural about the work and performative, whether I'm not sure that he would necessarily agree or not, or disagree, but the idea of there is a performance aspect, and there is this idea of like reconstructing, creating a sculpture with the body, with the tripod in the background, and then rephotographing, which I find interesting.
Mm.
It's beautiful too.
And of course, one thing too, that we saw in some of those earlier ones, he's never been shy about showing a white form and a black or brown form against each other. And so as far as race goes, he's been very proud of actually allowing that conversation to be had.
Yeah, and I think that I think there's so many layers within the work and so many layers in ways the conversation can be had. And I think by sort of also trying to talk about queerness or the Black body as like only part of the conversation, and or allowing those fragments to come in, but not making it the entire piece, I think it allows for more layers and a deeper conversation about how all of these things kind of interact. And this, you know, I love with the photograph of the person looking back, and then the figure in the foreground. Another one.
You know, his black hands, his black body in the center, the white bodies on either side, you know, the white hands. I mean, and then also, of course, he's putting studio furniture in there as well, too, which is sort of giving you a very real sense of what's happening.
And there's a complexity to the forms and layers. And I love this, the black hand on the bottom and the white hand folding, and then, you know, kind of the layers going back between the arm and the black figure in the background. They're actually pretty complex compositions.
Yeah, oh, completely.
He actually also had an exhibition, I think it was at the Whitney, where he actually then exhibited all the photographs that his friends took during the sessions as well, that were not used in the final compositions. So I think that was also interesting too, to be able to look at all the photographs that were taken that were not used. And again, most of the images too, this tripod remains center stage. So again, like nodding back to photography and activating the camera and the whole operation of photography and the act of photographing being center stage.
And also look at the gestures in both of those hands. The top gesture snapping the camera, but then that bottom gesture in the hand is just it's brilliant.
And open. And the slashes through the sheet, and then just wonderful.
Behind.
So Hunter, that is I'm gonna should I just stop the video?
Okay.
Oops, sorry. Let me just stop the share.
Well, we pretty much run out of time here, but so Andrea, I have one question for you before we wrap up. So, so I'm pulling you back a little bit as an artist, and as somebody who's just now presented an hour's worth of 3 artist queer work. And so, yes, of course, you're an administrator and you do a great job there at Anderson Ranch, but you're now talking about, you've spent an hour talking about the work of 3 artists through a queer lens. How does it feel? How does it sit with you? How does it sit with presenting this work to other artists, to the community at large? You know, how does it sit?
Well, I think while I find it a little nerve-wracking, just talking about any other artist's work, you know, because it's not something I normally do. I normally talk about my own work. And I think there's a little bit of a little bit of nervousness in presenting work through a queer lens, and sort of the potential criticism of saying, well, you know, how can you possibly, you know, talk about that work? You're not queer, and therefore you're talking about it and you don't know what you're talking about. But I think that, but with that said, one, I'm super glad you were in conversation with me, Hunter, because I think that was a lot easier. And I also, the work that I showed are people's work that I really believe in and think it's important work that they're doing. And it's important not only for the LGBT community, but for everyone. And I think that when I've seen like Doron or Jess present here at the ranch, where, you know, there may be a percentage of LGBT people, but much larger percentage of straight people, I find the conversations really are eye-opening, and it opens doors, and it opens people's ability to see something broader and not be so narrow. And I think if I can do that, or if the ranch can do that, or you can do that, I think that's what we need to be doing. These conversations are important and critical for us going forward, to stop people from being marginalized and from start having conversations and seeing people in a broader context than these little narrow little labels we put on people.
Amen. You know, and of course, that's one of the reasons why I thought you would be so good at being able to have a conversation. But, you know, think about the idea that, you know, you and I can talk about mid-20th century abstraction. We weren't there, but we can talk about it. We can talk about Remington's work in the Wild West. We weren't there, but we can talk about it. And so those who are empathetic toward the subject matter and the artist and what's behind the creativity, you have just proven the idea that just having a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of empathy, or in your case, a lot of knowledge and a lot of empathy, we can actually have a conversation about this stuff, which we don't have to be in those pigeonholes that you just talked about that other people are in. And so that's what's so amazing. It's so beautiful that you got to present this work in such a great way.
Thank you, Hunter. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, I do too. And thank you, everyone. Happy to have all of you here. This will be posted for all of you on Facebook. Hello, I see there are lots of people there. This is being recorded and it will be on our website at stonewall-museum.org, probably in about 72 hours. Give us a little bit of time. I want to say hello to my colleague, Paula Sierra. I think she's back there somewhere enjoying all of this. Paula, thank you. Thank you for all your help. We appreciate that. And everybody stay safe. Pride month is almost over. Enjoy the 4th of July, and let's all wish for great things for everybody. Andrea, lovely to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.